The story takes place in 1962 in the Bronx, New York. Tony Vallelonga works as a bouncer at a big nightclub called Copacabana. One day, he sees a very rich and powerful man from New York about to enter the club. This man gives his favorite hat to a woman at the club and tells her to keep it safe. He says he'll burn the club down if anything happens to his hat. Later, when the man wants his hat back, he finds out it's missing. He gets very angry and says he'll burn the club down if they don't find his hat by the next day. So, the club owner decides to close the club until they find the hat. Tony, who actually took the hat, hears about this and decides to return it to the man. He tells the man that he took the hat from a thief who got away. Because Tony returns the hat, the man gives him some money. Later, Tony went back to his house where he lived with his wife, Dolores, and their 2 sons. The next day, Tony noticed his wife giving drinks to 2 black plumbers using their glasses. After the plumbers left, Tony threw away the glasses they used because he was disgusted. During that time, racism in the United States was very bad because there were no laws about treating everyone equally, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Many white people, like Tony, were racist towards black people. That afternoon, Tony, who had already left for work, came back home and told his wife that Copacabana was still closed because it was being fixed up. Later, he got a call from someone he knew who offered him a job as a personal driver for a famous pianist named Don Shirley. Don was going on an 8-week concert tour in different cities across the United States. Tony was interested in the job and asked for Don's home address. The next day, he went to Don's fancy house and was surprised to see that Don was black. When Tony met him, Don was wearing a white robe with gold decorations and had on some gold jewelry. He was sitting in a tall chair that looked like a king's throne. Don asked Tony to work for him as both a chauffeur and a personal assistant during the tour, offering him $100 a week. However, Tony initially refused because he didn't want to be seen as a servant to a black person. Don then increased the offer to $125 a week after seeing Tony's excellent work reference. With this, Tony agreed to work for Don. They quickly planned the concert tour to be back in New York City by Christmas Eve. Before they set off, people from Don's record label gave Tony the keys to his car and a copy of the Green Book, which helped African-American travelers find places to stay, eat, and refuel in the segregated South. Initially, Tony and Don clashed because Tony felt uneasy about having to act more refined, while Don was disdainful of Tony's habits. They arrived in Pittsburgh in the evening, where Don was scheduled to perform at a luxury hotel for a white audience. With his musical companions, Oleg and George, Don gave a mesmerizing piano performance that astonished everyone, including Tony, who hadn't realized black people could play the piano so well. During the next tour stop in Hanover, Tony, acting as Don's assistant, had to ensure everything was ready for Don's concert. However, Tony was shocked to find the piano Don was supposed to play filled with garbage. When Tony asked a cleaner to tidy it up, the cleaner refused, saying that a trash-filled piano was suitable for black people. This angered Tony, and he ended up confronting the janitor. Finally, the piano was cleaned, and Don impressed the audience with his performance. Tony, now admiring Don's piano skills, wondered why Don, being black, chose to entertain white people who often looked down on him. Their next stop was Raleigh, where all the white attendees initially seemed welcoming. However, when Don needed to use the restroom, an attendant directed him to a separate black toilet outside, which was just a wooden cubicle. Don felt humiliated by this discrimination. He asked Tony to drive him back to their accommodation just to use the restroom. Witnessing the discrimination Don faced offstage, Tony grew even more curious about why Don remained silent and smiled at white people who treated him unfairly. Oleg, Don's cellist, shared with Tony that Don often faced discrimination, enduring insults, and even physical mistreatment from white people. Tony planned to write a letter to his wife and sons, expressing his longing for them. When Don read the letter, he found Tony's words lacking. He helped Tony rewrite the letter with more romantic and touching phrases. When Dolores received the letter, she was deeply moved by its beautiful language. In Memphis, Tony encountered two friends who were surprised to learn he worked for black men. They assumed Tony needed money badly to take such a job. One friend even offered Tony a job, but Tony politely declined. Later, Tony was invited for drinks by another friend, but he was surprised to find Don waiting outside his room. Don, thinking Tony might consider the job offer, doubled his wages to keep him. However, Tony assured Don he would stick to their agreement and not accept another job, even if it paid more. Later, Don and Tony were chatting in the hotel lobby, and Don shared his journey as a pianist signed by a record company. Tony suggested that Don should play the music he enjoys, not just classical pieces, as people admire Don's piano skills more than the specific music genre. Don was touched by Tony's praise and support, although he was contracted to play classical music. During a tour in Louisville, Don was attacked by a group of white men in a bar, but Tony intervened and saved him. Tony then insisted that Don stick close to him for safety throughout the tour. Tony also encouraged Don to reconnect with his estranged brother, but Don hesitated, feeling distant from his family due to his career and accomplishments. In another incident, Don was caught in a homosexual encounter with a white man at a pool in the South, and Tony bribed officers to avoid Don's arrest. One night, while driving through Mississippi, their car was stopped by police who mistook them for criminals. They were accused of being involved in illegal activities. Feeling offended, Tony reacted by punching one of the police officers, which led to their arrest and imprisonment. While in jail, Don asked to speak with his lawyer and used the opportunity to reach out to Robert F. Kennedy, the United States Attorney General. Kennedy pressured the governor and the police to release them. Seeing the officers frightened after Don's call, Tony became curious about who he contacted. As they resumed their journey, Don finally disclosed that he had reached out to the president's younger brother, who served as the Attorney General, to secure their release. Initially engaged in a casual argument, Tony made a comment about Don being a wealthy black man with a perfect life, which deeply angered Don. He stormed out of the car. Tony followed, and Don expressed his frustration, revealing that despite his wealth, he felt lonely and misunderstood. White people looked down on him, and some of his own community saw him as a traitor. He lacked genuine friendship. Hearing Don's heartfelt confession, Tony fell silent and apologized. They returned to the car and continued their journey. On the last night of the tour in Birmingham, Don faced discrimination again when he was given a dressing room in the janitor's area, while his white musicians got a better, more luxurious space. Despite this, Don remained patient and didn't want to make a fuss over small matters. Before the show, Tony suggested they have dinner, joined by Oleg and George. Oleg mentioned that Don didn't need to tour because he was already wealthy. However, Don chose to tour to promote equality for black people and gain recognition from the wider community. As Don was about to enter the restaurant, a waiter stopped him, saying black people weren't allowed in the white dining room. Tony tried to negotiate with the restaurant manager, but the manager insisted on segregation, even after Don threatened to cancel the concert. When the manager insulted Don, Tony almost punched him, but Don stopped him. Don left the decision to Tony whether they should proceed with the show or leave. Tony feels sad when Don suggests canceling the concert, but he agrees and they all leave. Instead of dining at the segregated restaurant, Tony and Don go to a black blues club. When the waitresses learn Don is a pianist, they invite him to play on stage in exchange for a meal. Don's piano performance impresses the club's patrons, and he enjoys playing music he genuinely likes for the first time. Afterward, they head home, experiencing various events on Christmas Eve. Caught in a snowstorm, Don insists that Tony go home to be with his family. Don takes over driving, and after a long journey, they reach Tony's house. Tony invites Don to join his family for dinner, but Don declines and returns home. After returning home, Don reflects on Tony's advice to pursue his own happiness. He decides to visit Tony's house, where he receives a warm welcome from Tony's extended family. Tony's family is impressed by Don's influence on Tony, who used to be racist but now has close and friendly relationships with black men like Don. Dolores embraces Don and expresses gratitude for helping Tony write a heartfelt letter to her. The closing credits feature real-life photos of the characters, indicating that Don continued touring, composing, and recording music, while Tony resumed his job at Copacabana. It also notes that Tony and Don remained friends until their deaths, which occurred within months of each other in 2013. So the moral of the story is, if you're going to borrow someone's hat, make sure it's not from a guy who threatens to burn down the joint. It's all fun in games until the nightclub goes up in flames over headwear.